In the climactic moments of Revenge of the Sith, as Chancellor Palpatine declares himself Emperor before the Galactic Senate, Padmé Amidala delivers one of the most haunting lines in Star Wars history. "So this is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause." This moment represents not just the fall of the Republic, but the complete political destruction of one of its most principled defenders. Padmé's character arc in Episode 3 serves as a masterful allegory for how liberal democracy fails when confronted with rising authoritarianism, and her personal downfall mirrors the institutional collapse happening around her. Throughout the prequel trilogy, Padmé Amidala has been established as the embodiment of democratic ideals. From her days as the young queen of Naboo, fighting against the Trade Federation's illegal occupation, to her role as a senator advocating for peaceful solutions to galactic conflicts, she represents the best of what the Republic stands for. Her political philosophy is rooted in negotiation, compromise, and the belief that democratic institutions can solve even the most complex problems. She consistently argues for diplomatic solutions over military ones, opposes the creation of a clone army, and fights against the emergency powers that gradually erode the senatorial authority. However, Revenge of the Sith systematically dismantles everything Padmé believes in, both politically and personally. The film opens with her opposing the continued militarization of the Republic, arguing against increased executive powers for Palpatine, and trying to build a coalition of senators to restore constitutional governance. She represents the loyal opposition, working within the system to preserve democratic norms, even as those very norms are being weaponized against democracy itself. The tragedy of Padmé's political position is that she follows all the rules of democratic engagement while her opponent, Palpatine, systematically breaks them. She builds coalitions through persuasion and compromise, while he manufactures crises to justify emergency powers. She respects institutional boundaries while he manipulates those same institutions from within. She appeals to the better angels of senatorial conscience, while he exploits their fears and prejudices. This asymmetric political warfare leaves Padmé constantly playing defense, responding to crisis rather than setting the agenda. George Lucas deliberately crafted Padmé's political arc to demonstrate how authoritarian movements exploit the very openness and procedural fairness that make democracy possible. When she organizes the delegation of 2,000 to petition Palpatine about returning his emergency powers, she is acting exactly as a responsible senator should in a healthy democracy. The petition is respectful, constitutional, and represents a significant portion of the Senate. Yet this legitimate political action is immediately reframed by Palpatine as treason, demonstrating how authoritarians turn democratic participation itself into evidence of disloyalty. The personal dimension of Padmé's downfall cannot be separated from the political. Her secret marriage to Anakin represents a compromise of her public principles for private happiness, creating the very kind of hidden vulnerability that authoritarian systems exploit. Palpatine's manipulation of Anakin is simultaneously an attack on Padmé's personal life and her political effectiveness. By turning her husband into an agent of the regime she opposes, Palpatine ensures that her most intimate relationship becomes a source of political isolation and personal anguish. This intersection of personal and political destruction reflects a deeper truth about how authoritarianism operates. It does not simply defeat political opponents, it corrupts the relationships and institutions that give meaning to political resistance. Padmé cannot effectively oppose Palpatine's regime, because doing so would require her to oppose her own husband, who has become Darth Vader. The man she loves has become the enforcer of everything she stands against, making her political resistance inseparable from personal betrayal. The Senate scene where Palpatine declares the Empire represents the culmination of Padmé's political helplessness. Despite her best efforts to build opposition, despite her principled stance and coalition building, she can only watch as democracy commits suicide through its own procedures. The thunderous applause that greets the Empire's birth comes from the very senators she has been trying to rally to democracy's defense. This moment reveals the ultimate failure of her political strategy. She assumed that democratic institutions would protect democracy, when in fact those institutions had already been captured and turned against their original purpose. Lucas uses Padmé's reaction to this moment to illustrate how liberal Democrats often respond to authoritarian takeover with shock and disbelief, rather than effective resistance. Her stunned silence in the face of the applause reflects the paralysis that overtakes democratic opposition when the unthinkable becomes reality. She has spent the entire film working within the system to preserve the system, only to discover that the system itself has become the weapon of its own destruction. The visual language of the Senate scene reinforces Padmé's political isolation. She is shown in wide shots that emphasize her smallness within the vast chamber, surrounded by cheering senators who have embraced the very authoritarianism she has fought against. The camera work makes her appear overwhelmed and powerless, a lone voice of conscience in an institution that has lost its moral compass. This visual metaphor extends beyond Star Wars to represent the experience of democratic opposition in any society sliding toward authoritarianism. Padmé's final political act, her attempt to convince Anakin to abandon the dark side on Mustafar, represents both the nobility and the futility of her approach to politics. She appeals to their shared values, their love for each other, and his better nature, believing that personal connection and moral argument can overcome the systematic corruption that has consumed him. This scene encapsulates the liberal democratic faith in reason, dialogue, and human goodness as solutions to political problems, even when those problems have moved beyond the realm where such solutions are effective. The failure of this final appeal, and Anakin's violent rejection of her plea, symbolizes the moment when democratic politics becomes impossible. When one side abandons shared norms and embraces violence as a political tool, the other side's commitment to peaceful resolution becomes a fatal weakness rather than a moral strength. Padmé's death, immediately following this confrontation, represents not just personal tragedy, but the death of the political values she embodied. Her dying words, that there is still good in Anakin, represent both the persistence of her democratic faith and its tragic inadequacy in the face of systematic evil. Even as she dies, she maintains her belief in redemption and moral transformation, the very qualities that made her an effective democratic leader, but an ineffective opponent of authoritarianism. This persistence of hope in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary reflects both the nobility and the vulnerability of democratic political culture. The broader implications of Padmé's political downfall extend far beyond the Star Wars universe. Her character arc serves as a warning about how democratic institutions and norms can be systematically undermined by those who understand their weaknesses better than their defenders understand their strengths. Her tragedy is not that she was a poor politician, but that she was an excellent democratic politician in a situation that required something democracy could not provide: the willingness to abandon democratic norms to preserve democratic values. Lucas's portrayal of Padmé's downfall ultimately suggests that democracy's greatest strength, its openness to different viewpoints and commitment to procedural fairness, becomes its greatest vulnerability when confronted with movements that exploit that openness to destroy the system from within. Her character represents the tragic figure of the principled Democrat who follows the rules even as her opponents break them, who builds coalitions even as her opponents build cults of personality, and who appeals to reason even as her opponents appeal to fear and hatred. The thunderous applause that marks democracy's death in Star Wars serves as a chilling reminder that authoritarianism often arrives not through violent revolution, but through the enthusiastic consent of the governed, manipulated by leaders who understand how to exploit democratic procedures for undemocratic ends. Padmé Amidala's political downfall stands as both a tribute to democratic values and a warning about their fragility in the face of systematic assault.